Hello everybody, and welcome to the Drydock episode 298. This week the questions are taken from guides 376 and 377, that's the Everts-class destroyer escorts and the Golden Hind of Francis Drake, along with the Wednesday videos on the development of the 18.1-inch gun and USS Monitor over at the Mariners Museum in Newport News. And that of course means it's time to get on with the questions. Let's go. Vintage Car History asks, how common was it for small Navy ships to enter civilian service after World War II? It depended quite a bit on the specific type of civilian ship, but for some classes it was actually extremely common. So for the Flower class, for instance, well over 100 of them were sold off for civilian uses, which is perhaps easily explained by the fact the Flower class was derived from a civilian hull in the first place, so adaptation wouldn't be too difficult. But essentially, when you're looking at a small warship, i.e. something the size of a small destroyer on down, to get a general rule of thumb as to how many of them proportionally would have gone into civilian service, obviously, would a lot of them, some of them, not many. Apart from, did any of them survive the war in the first place? But assuming there's a reasonable number left around, and usually Allied ones, you want to either look for something that's really small, something that could be operated by, 1, 2, 3 people, and those kinds of things would usually be taken into private use, as in, an individual owns it. So PT boats, MTBs, MGBs, that kind of thing. Essentially as glorified power boats with interesting histories to them and, pretty high performance ones at that with a fair degree of seakeeping as compared to, a custom built unit to that kind of spec, which would cost you a lot more than a surplus small fast attack craft. The other type would be, ships like the Flower class, relatively commodious, relatively easy to operate on small crews, and therefore usually using older engine technologies, although not necessarily all the time, and generally relatively low speed, because low speed simple engines don't require a huge amount of crew, period, and fewer specialist trained crew as well. And those larger vessels, like corvettes and frigates, would usually end up in still obviously in private hands, but in the hands of commercial entities as fishing ships, cargo vessels, survey vessels, and this kind of thing. Because at that point, it's very, very rare that an individual is going to be wealthy enough to purchase even a surplus warship of, several hundred to maybe up just over 1,000 tons displacement. And rarer still that they would be able to afford to crew it, because at that point you do need an actual crew to service and maintain the thing. It did happen, of course. Famously, one of the River-class frigates was converted into a private yacht, but generally ships like corvettes and patrol boats and stuff would end up in commercial hands, whether that be harbour work or long-distance overseas work. Once you started to get a little bit further up the scale and you started looking at things like destroyer escorts, most frigates, etc., although some of them would enter civilian service, they're a lot rarer. Not necessarily because they were unaffordable, because the big commercial organisations could just as easily afford a few frigates as they could afford a corvette or two, but because they were less suitable for merchant work. So they would have been built usually more to military spec, so there would be a lot more subdivision, which is good for survival, but not so good if you're trying to transport cargo or really much of anything other than, people. And, of course, they tend to be built for speed, which further narrows their hulls relative to their length. And because they're built for speed, their power plants require more maintenance, they require more crew, and they use more fuel, all of which would tend to make them somewhat uneconomical outside of specific niche uses. Unryu Maru asks, had the Germans been able to make their reload mechanisms compact enough to fit behind the guns, could the Scharnhorst-class have been armed with 14-inch 3-gun primary turrets? Well, as with the 15-inch refits that they were going to undergo, the Scharnhorst would have needed some work to their bow, whether that be additional widening of the bow, lengthening of the bow, whatever they were going to do. With the 15-inch, they were going to lengthen the bow. But the Scharnhorst were a little bit bow-heavy in their design, so if you're going to include 6 guns up front of 14-inch size instead of the 11-inch that they had, then yeah, you would need to do something to address that as well. But in terms of the barbette diameters and everything, yes, I mean, it probably would have required you going either with something other than Krupp or persuading Krupp to abandon the brass cartridge and sliding breech block mechanisms. But there is actually the space, because the internal barbette diameter of the Scharnhorst is about 33 feet. And to give you some kind of reference, that's actually a slightly wider diameter by between 3 and 5 feet, depending on which particular mounting you're looking at, than the triple 14-inch guns found on the US Standard Class battleships. So, it's quite literally the case that, all the other reworking of ammunition hoist and everything aside, if you'd picked up the triple 14s from the, let's say, the Tennessees, and dropped them into the barbette ring of the Scharnhorsts, you'd actually have space to spare. You'd actually have to make some kind of little sleeve to tuck them into, which is slightly amusing. But as I said, you'd almost certainly have to persuade the Germans to go with full bag charges rather than all the ancillary equipment involved with the brass casings, the sliding breech blocks, the ejections for the brass casings, and everything else they managed to cram in there. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, I recently discovered that Rear Admiral Richard E. Byrd, possibly, it's spelled B-Y-R-D, I don't know why, famous for his many accomplishments in the interwar Antarctic expeditions, was the confidential advisor to none other than Admiral King of anti-British and anti-Byrd fame. I find this quite odd, as my somewhat limited understanding of both men seems to indicate that this would be a match made in hell. Could you elaborate on how these two managed to not kill each other? Honestly, I don't know enough about Byrd to judge whether or not he would have had massive personal clashes with King. The last time they seemed to run into each other before the Second World War was when they were both under the Bureau of Aeronautics under Admiral Moffat, and King and Moffat did clash somewhat, and Byrd was a favourite of Moffat. But King seemed to be relatively directed in his anger against various people, so I don't think the fact that Byrd was a favourite of Moffat would, in and of itself, have alienated him from King, because King didn't seem to work like that. But maybe someone else knows why there would be more potential for conflict there. But in any case, Byrd, while he was an advisor to King, was mostly sent out and about to find out things in the Pacific and other areas, and then report back. So he was away from King for quite a bit of time. So even if there was a specific reason the two might fight like cats and dogs, if Byrd is just not physically there and is half a planet away for the majority of the war, scouting things and finding things and sending that information back, well, then there's relatively little room for conflict. I do absolutely love the fact that, interwar Antarctic and Arctic expeditionary gear, as you can see Byrd wearing here. Obviously, yes, I know he probably would have worn a tropical uniform, but it kind of amuses me to imagine that he actually went touring the Pacific dressed like this. UNSC Forward Onto Dawn asks, where would you say is the definitive beginning of the Royal Navy? That's a little bit of a difficult one, because there are two time periods usually advanced by historians. One would be the reign of King Alfred the Great, back before we even were into 4-digit years, and that is based on the fact that he seems to have been the first person who could lay claim to being a king of at least most of England, who commissioned a specific war fleet and maintained it for a while. The problem, of course, is that that fleet then gradually fell into disarray later on in the reign of his successors, and after that, such royal vessels as existed were mostly personal prestige and transport craft with a sort of sideline in occasionally fighting wars. The majority of English fleets for most of the medieval period tended to be a small core of royal vessels supplemented by a lot of private vessels, both private merchant vessels and vessels owned by various nobles that were brought in. So, whilst technically you could say that is the first in the line of continuity, that's the first royal-owned warship, and subsequent to that there were pretty much always royal-owned warships of some form or other, even if there are only one or two, and thus that could be the Royal Navy. The other date that a lot of people tend to advance is the reign of King Henry VIII, because he went and took a lot of money that his father Henry VII had quietly squirreled away, combined it with eventually a bunch of money he got from the dissolution of the monasteries, and with it he built up a significantly larger fleet than his predecessors had had. And that, especially considering at the time you get ships like the Mary Rose and the Great Harry and so forth, these are now heavily gun-armed warships designed, whilst they all occasionally do serve as royal yachts, but they are primarily designed to facilitate battle. And it kind of obviously continues from there in fits and starts until later on. So a lot of people would cite that as the start of the Royal Navy, and that's a decent argument as well. And I would support, within certain contexts, both of those dates. But if you wanted me to put a period and say, right, this is the kind of the definitive beginning of where the Royal Navy, as we understand it for the period the Channel covers, begins, i.e. a big battle fleet that is essentially entirely, or almost entirely, state-owned warships, or royal-owned warships, I would actually go for the reign of Charles I, because as we see with things like the Spanish Armada and then the English Armada and so forth, whilst Henry VIII's Tudor fleet is significantly larger, more powerful, more dedicated for war than previously, the national effort when it comes to going to war in that time is still majority-wise in terms of number of hulls made up of privately owned hulls with a core of royal vessels. Whereas Charles I takes, again, funding and through ship money, actually one of the major causes for the English Civil War, but he does create Sovereign of the Seas, which you've been seeing during this answer. He massively bulks up the Royal Navy, and then the Commonwealth or Republic or whatever you want to call it, the short experiment in England with not having a monarch, which resulted in a bunch of puritanical, fanatical religious zealots taking over, which is why we're pretty comfortable having monarchs back, thank you very much. Then, they refined it, for all this legitimate criticisms you can level at Cromwell, he did at least forge the Commonwealth Navy into quite the fighting force. Obviously, admirals like Monk and so forth did the actual business end of the fighting. And you get the first Anglo-Dutch wars flaring up around this time. And I would say that is actually the time period. So Charles I and Cromwell, that's the time period when the Royal Navy consolidates into the fleet of the state, where it is the war fleet owned and operated by the monarchy-state for achieving state goals without significant private warship support. And that is the fleet that we then see run through the rest of the Age of Sail and into the Age of Steam and Steel. Related to that, actually, BK Zhang asks, would Sovereign of the Seas have been competitive in the early 19th century with updated armaments? I vaguely recall answering a similar question some time ago, but nevertheless, yes, I think she could have been. She would have been a bit of a ship of Theseus by then, But based on her overall dimensions and displacement and the weight of guns that she carried, she could still have been a competitive vessel in the Battle of Trafalgar, for instance. Warships had grown a little larger than her, not massively so, but still somewhat. In terms of her gun deck length, beam, and draft, by the time of Trafalgar, her dimensions would have been more in keeping with a larger third rate, so a 74 gunner. First rate, well, at least a British first rate of the Trafalgar period was about 20 foot longer, about 3 foot wider, 2 to 3 foot deeper in draft. Mainly the length being the factor there. So, given that she was refitted, cut down, and reworked several times, Sovereign of the Seas probably, I think, would have been cut down at some point to a two-decker, and then served as still at that point a fairly large two-decker. The dimensions of third rates of about that size would only really catch up in the very end of the 18th century. And so, yeah, as a 74 gunner or maybe an 80 gunner, depending on how many gun ports she would have by that point on the lower two gun decks, I think she would have been competitive, but no longer a absolute front-line vessel. Even a second-rate ship of the line, which obviously is slightly smaller than the first rate, was still sort of 10 foot longer than her. So retaining her as an extra short and stubby, maybe 90-gun second rate, I mean, it could be done, but why would you, really? I mean, yes, in theory, yes, that could remain so, but I suspect you'd gain a lot more by removing the upper gun deck, having two gun decks with very heavy guns and retaining the sail pattern, so essentially raséing down, which actually historically, well, she wasn't completely raséed, but she was significantly cut down in her upper works during her actual service life. Edward Dunn asks, why did deck edge elevators take so long to be introduced onto aircraft carriers? They seem to offer significant advantages over centerline elevators in space utilization on the flight deck and in the hangar, and in reducing the risk of the carrier suffering a mission kill if they get stuck in the down position or destroyed. Given that centerline elevators are still being used on modern aircraft and helicopter carriers, there must be some sort of trade-off I'm unaware of. There's a few reasons depending on the type of carrier you're looking at. So if you're looking at, say, a British-style armoured flight deck carrier, like an Illustrious or something, that means that the hangar deck, and the sides of it, therefore, are part of the hull girder, as is the case with a few other carrier designs, even without an armoured hangar deck, to a certain degree. At which point, if you are going to put a flight deck elevator on the side, you're cutting a sock and grate hole in your hull girder, which causes some structural issues, to say the least. Another problem, which is definitely more of an issue with the interwar period carriers, is that if you either have a double height hangar, i.e. two hangars one on top of the other, like a lot of British carriers did, armoured or not, or you have a particularly tall hangar period, like a lot of the US carriers did, what that means is that your flight deck might be well above the waves and the waterline, which is great, but again, you have to cut a sock and grate opening in the side of your ship, and the actual level of the hangar deck, or the lower hangar deck if you have two, may be somewhat worryingly close to the waterline, especially in rough weather. And that obviously has two problems. One, water coming in through the sock and grate hole, even if you put some kind of barrier up there in heavy seas, that will probably get damaged, if not destroyed, and water admitted. This is one of the reasons why even these days deck edge elevators tend to be further back on carriers. You don't see that many carriers with deck edge elevators in the forward half of the ship. And of course, apart from water potentially getting into the hangar, you also have issues with aircraft out on said elevator who may then be washed off by the waves. And obviously people on that elevator as well, which is also a problem. there's a minor degree of balance as well, because you're sticking a bit of a weight further out on the side of the ship. That's a relatively minor issue that can be calculated away in design. The larger aircraft carriers get, the less this is a problem. Hence why one of the reasons why you start to see them come in as carriers get bigger and bigger. Another problem is machinery, because of course a centerline elevator can either have motors and racks and pinions running on all four corners or down either side, or you can have a set of socking great hydraulic lifts lifting it up from underneath, or whatever combination you want. Whereas with a deck edge elevator, a true edge elevator, kind of like this prototype you see on WASP, you either have to go in with a lot of extremely heavy horizontal machinery with sticking out cantilever arms, which is what they did here, or you have to accept that with only being able to lift from one side, that elevator is going to have a limited lift capacity compared to your centerline elevators, which may limit its utility, again, unless you want to go into a whole load of additional structural weight and machinery, etc., to mitigate that issue, which is then taking weight away from other parts of the carrier where it could be used. And also, if you're still worried about incoming shell fire or splinter damage, which is, again, very much a thing in the interwar design considerations, again, having a massive great hole at your hangar deck level is not necessarily a particularly brilliant idea. Even carriers like the Yorktowns, which had deck armor on their hangar deck rather than their flight deck, would tend to have at least some form of splinter proofing down the sides of the hangar. But I don't think you can really find rolling shutters in 1.5 inch thick STS, or if you can, good luck finding motors and so forth to run that, without massive, again, excessive weight effects on an interwar period carrier. Someone whose username looks like they just smashed their head into the keyboard several times asks, why build a 3-gun instead of a triple turret? A 3-gun turret, for those of you who are unaware, is the same number of guns as a triple turret. The technical difference is that a triple turret is 3 guns, but they must uniformly elevate together. So essentially they're all locked as one thing. So they might have a common cradle, a single common elevating mechanism, but essentially they all have to act in concert or not at all. Whereas a 3-gun turret, as you can see here with Nelson, can elevate each gun individually and separately, regardless of what the other guns are doing. So obviously this is more complex because you need individual gun cradles, you need individual gun elevation mechanisms, and so on and so forth. So why do it? And, as a colloquial shorthand, I tend to refer to single, twin, triple, and quadruple turrets, just because that's an easy reference. People understand instinctively, how many guns are involved in this turret. But during the early part of the 20th century, there is a transition from what are, technically speaking, twin and triple turrets to 2-gun and 3-gun turrets. But, that's a little bit of semantics aside, because it only really becomes important in very specific situations. Nonetheless, why would you do this? There's, a few different things. If one of the guns gets jammed, either through mechanical failure, if it takes a direct hit or something like that, then the entire mechanism on a triple turret, for example, would freeze up. You've lost control of that turret. Similarly, if your elevation mechanism fails, that's it. Your turret's gone completely. Also, if you're trying to fire salvos, if you have a problem with one of the guns, let's say one of them is loading a bit slower than the others, you either have to wait for that one, so delays your ability to fire the entire turret, or you elevate the whole thing whilst one of them is still in the process of loading and or possibly has an error in drill, which could go interestingly. I mean, the shell, once it's been rammed in, is going to stay in place, assuming it has been rammed in at that point, but the charge bags may come back, which, that's why you delay. And it also means if you want to fire ranging salvos, and that's especially important with ships armed with 3-gun guns rather than twin turrets or quad turrets, because remember the ideal minimum salvo size is 4, that you realistically want to fire all the guns on a triple turret at once or none of them, whereas with a 3-gun turret you can elevate the guns that are ready and fire those without affecting the gun that isn't ready, and you can pull off rather snazzy little tricks. So for example, a ship with 3 triple turrets, if you wanted to, let's say you were going to go down for 3-gun salvos, so you're really pushing it out there, you could, rather than fire all the guns from one turret, and thus the flight pattern of those shells will be dependent on what that turret is doing and where it is on the ship, with a 3-gun turret you could elevate 1 gun from each turret and fire a 3-gun salvo with using all 3 turrets, and then you can fire another 3-gun salvo. So you can get 3 3-gun salvos that are ranged along the length of the ship, and thus the scatter of those shots should be relatively consistent because you're contributing 1 shell from each turret each time, rather than 3 shells from one, 3 shells from another, 3 shells from a third, each of which may be operating on slightly different principles and, of course, are physically in different locations on the ship. And if you want a 4-gun salvo and a 5-gun salvo, for instance, again, you can elevate 1 gun, and 2, and then 2 guns, 2 guns and 1, or you could do 3 guns from one turret with 1 from another, whilst the other 2 are reloading, and so on and so forth. So it gives you a lot more flexibility, a lot more options, and a lot more redundancy, albeit it does cost you a little bit more weight and space. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, while it is said that the 18-inch 47 caliber gun was most likely not going to be able to fit on the triple turret without making possible sacrifices to speed on a Panamax, aka Iowa hull, could the 16-inch 56 caliber gun, either the prototype or more purpose-built designs, have been fitted in a triple turret on the Iowa or Montana hull form instead? It's possible. I wouldn't have wanted to use the prototype gun because, of course, the prototype 16-inch 56 was a refitted 18-inch gun, so it still had would have still had all the dimensional issues of an 18-inch weapon, at least for the gun itself, if not for the shells. But if they had decided to proceed with the 16-inch 56 and designed a brand new weapon with similar performance characteristics, well, at that point, the shells and the charges would have been similar to a 16-inch 50, if not identical. So the hoists would have been the same dimensions. The gun diameter, in terms of the width of the turret and the spacing, would have been the same. Weight and therefore balance point and how far back the gun comes into the turret, that would have been slightly different. That may have caused some issues because obviously, as we know, the 16-inch 50 and its turret had to be mated together at the very last minute thanks to some screw-ups because the original pairing wasn't going to fit together. And if you watch the Battleship New Jersey channel, you will have seen Ryan going abreast the turret 1 barbette, and you can see just how little space there actually is between the barbette and the ship's outer protection layers at some point. So on an Iowa-class hull, you probably really can't afford to make the barbette much bigger, if at all. So you may have fractionally struggled with an Iowa. It would really depend on if the 16-inch 56 had to sit so far further back into the turret that you required a wider barbette diameter or not. If it only had to come back a few inches and you could get away with it, perhaps with repositioning the rotation point slightly as well, relative to the turret, then you might just about get away with it. But I think it would be a very tight fit on an Iowa. On a Montana, you've probably got a bit more wiggle room to play with. Third Base asks, was there ever a thought of fitting a temporary framework of wood or canvas to increase Monitor's freeboard? And would that even work? In theory, it could have been done. I'm not aware of any particular thought having been given to doing it at the time. And that's, I think, for 2 reasons. The reason, by the way, you're seeing HMVS Cerberus here instead of Monitor is that something very similar to what you described was actually done for Cerberus so that she could make the journey from the UK to Australia. without sinking. The problem is that, one, they thought that the sealant that they'd put on Monitor would work. So, of course, why go through extra expense if you think that's going to work? And secondly, you run into a little bit of a problem in that a temporary wood and canvas framework would keep some waves from washing over the deck of the ship, which would improve her seakeeping, improve the comfort of the men, etc. But any relatively temporary wood and canvas structure would of necessity not be particularly strong, and so would only provide relief in mild seas, and probably only mitigation at that, which would mean that in the kind of storm that eventually sank Monitor, it would probably be more of a hindrance than anything else, because it would be smashed and broken up and dragged across the deck and mangle people and jam into things and so on and so forth, and not really stop the big seas that actually sank Monitor anyway. In order to do that, you would have needed a much more substantial structure able to withstand the force of those seas, and you would have needed some kind of probably on-deck pump as well, because, of course, no matter what reasonable structure you put around Monitor, in that kind of storm weather, you are going to be taking water green over whatever barrier you put up, assuming it can withstand the pressures. And the last thing you want to do, of course, is create an impromptu swimming pool, so you would need a pump on deck to get rid of any water that came over regardless, without it, filtering down into the rest of the ship, which is exactly the thing you're trying to avoid. So, yes, it could have been done, but it would have been a lot more expensive, a lot more time-consuming to do, and as far as I'm aware, no one really thought of that extent of work. Echo Mage asks, say a large international conflict breaks out in the early 1860s, perhaps in some way ignited by the American Civil War. Could the fast trade clipper ships have been converted into effective commerce raiders, perhaps even modified into very light sloops of war with an engine system? In theory, I could see that happening. I mean, obviously the clippers could move at a fair old rate, and they do have, at least the later ones, a reasonable degree of cargo capacity, so if you converted that to supplies and guns, they could stick around for quite a while on the high seas. I suspect, however, that auxiliary steam engines probably would have helped, so it would have been a near total conversion, mostly because obviously there's times when the wind is calm, but also the clippers ran with specific trade winds. And with the growing, extent of both steam-powered warships, or at least auxiliary steam-powered warships at that time period, and auxiliary steam-powered merchant vessels and so forth, you could have merchant ships that could escape a purely sail-powered vessel, either just by sailing in the opposite direction to the wind, or sailing in a period where the wind was really calm, or sailing off of the trade winds in a more geographically direct route. And so, to maximize their benefit, your theoretical converted clipper raider / commerce protector, depending on which side of the war you're on, I think would definitely need some kind of auxiliary steam engine to go with it. And part of the issue, of course, would be the fact that for every clipper that's being converted into a trade protection vessel, there's also going to be someone else using them as a blockade runner or similar. So, you need a ship that fast to catch the other ship that fast. This is A.B. Coates asks, you mentioned that USS Monitor had its doorknob stolen by tourists during its stint in the Washington Navy Yard. Are there any other notable instances of ships being looted either by their own crews or tourists, and what were the most popular items to steal? Well, back in the day, it essentially tended to happen to any semi-famous warship or ship that was opened up to the general public. And, well, what they would take, pretty much as with Monitor, anything that wasn't bolted down, some things that were, the main restriction essentially seemed to be, can we slip this into our bag, pocket, under our cloak, or applicable dress of the period? If it was blatantly obvious, carrying away chairs and tables and so forth was perhaps going to get you caught, although some ships were actually also looted of various bits of furniture, but presumably by people who are very good at pretending to be dockyard workers. But yeah, back in the day, opening a ship up to the general public without a significant guard was an invitation to have everything stripped off of it in very, very short order. And unfortunately, that is not something that's necessarily stopped. There are people these days, even still, who will purloin pocketable items that they can find on museum ships right down to today. I mean, if you talk to any number of museum ships, they have different ways of dealing with it. Some of them have just put, the relevant bits that could be stolen behind perspex screens. Some have just been forced to close off sections of the ship so you can only look at them. So if you physically can't reach the bits that people might try and steal. Others have just, either locked or glued things in place so that it would be much more difficult to make off with things. Some have just accepted that some parts are just going to be stolen, so replacements, if they're easy to source, can be sourced. And others have just gone, well, if this thing has been stolen, and perhaps stolen repeatedly, and is not easily able to be restricted, then maybe, nowadays especially, I know some museum ships have actually been 3D printing replacement parts. So if it's things like switches and light covers and so forth, if you 3D print a part that looks 99% as good, then you can keep the original safely tucked away. The artifact still looks perfectly fine, but if somebody does try and make off with said small item, well, they're getting a few pence worth of, cheap modern filament plastic instead of an original piece, which is better for everyone involved, even the person in question, because then if they do get caught, the charges for stealing a few pence of plastic are probably somewhat less than stealing a relatively irreplaceable historical artifact. And when ships are decommissioned, if it's known the ship is being decommissioned and going to the scrapyard, most of the time officers tend to turn a little bit of a blind eye at that point to crew making off with various bits and pieces to remember the ship by, usually because the officers are doing the same thing. And then it all goes very quiet, and then a few years or even a few decades down the line, all sorts of various interesting bits of the ship start to resurface in various places when it was thought that those bits and pieces were long since lost to the scrappers. Spilled Epsom Salt asks, what was ballast like on CSS Virginia? Both she and Monitor seem very top-heavy. The sloped armour of CSS Virginia probably helps a little bit with keeping weight more towards the centre line, I would imagine. Well, being based on the hull of the Merrimack, the Virginia would have had ballast, at least the fixed ballast, pretty much commensurate with what Merrimack had. And yes, both Monitor and Virginia have substantial amounts of iron armour above the waterline, but at the same time, I mean, Monitor is a unique design, but the majority of Monitor's significantly above water armour is just her turret. You can see from the profile that's not a huge amount of the ship. And with Virginia, although she does have substantially more significant above waterline material, the fact is when you compare her profile to the profile of the same ship when she was USS Merrimack, yes, the wooden hull and the masts and everything are less dense than the iron, but they're also significantly higher above the waterline, which obviously has an impact on stability. So then when you look at the cross sections, as you can see in the lower half of this picture, you notice that comparative to the height above waterline, the ship's beam is quite considerable. So yes, if either one of these ships did actually flip over, as indeed Monitor did when she sank, probably after she slipped beneath the water, then they're going to remain upside down because, relative to the overall centre of rotation of the ship, most of the weight is above that. But with a relatively extensive beam relative to above waterline height, they're actually fairly stable as in they're gonna stay upright and not capsize unless and until you tip them a very, very, very long way over. Once they do that, they will not come back. Compared to perhaps a more conventional wooden ship, which you might be able to turn back upright, you'd have to put as much energy into getting it back up the other way. But they're surprisingly stable designs because of that low profile. Brad in SoCal asks, was there anything particularly interesting about the Royal Navy's East Indies station during the period of 1865 to the onset of World War I? Did the ending of the US Civil War in 1865 influence the decision to reorganise the Royal Navy's fleet in this way? There's no particular evidence to suggest that the end of the US Civil War influenced the Royal Navy, that should be, from splitting the East Indies and China Station into the East Indies Station and the China Station as two separate commands. Apart from anything, although the US Navy had obviously ended in the US Civil War as a very large force, it was a mostly coastal force in terms of its ongoing warships, and much of its strength, both coastal and oceanic, was rapidly diminished in the following years. And ultimately, the US didn't have a huge amount of interest in the area covered by the East Indies Station. They had a little bit more interest in the Western Pacific, which would have been covered by the China and Australia stations, but that's a slightly different story. What it seems to have mostly been is an increasing divergence of requirements for the two areas. Plus, of course, the fact that the East Indies and China Station technically ran all the way from the northern part of the Western Pacific all the way over to the Red Sea and the coast of South Africa, which was a bit of a big area to cover. But on the China Station, what you really mostly wanted was small shallow draft gunboats with a handful of cruisers to go wandering up and down the Western Pacific region, whereas on the East Indies Station, which is essentially the Indian Ocean and ancillary attached areas, you don't have too much need for that many gunboats, but you do need quite a lot of cruisers, frigates, sloops, etc., to do long-distance patrolling, commerce protection, not so much anti-piracy stuff, but of course at that point you have British India, so there's a lot of coastal but not so much riverine work. And the other important thing is that you have the slave trade suppression mission still going on. So obviously there's the West Africa Squadron, which I've covered in a previous video, which I maybe will update at some point in the near future with a much more extensive video. But there was also quite a ongoing slave trade along the East African coastline, and the East Indies Squadron was tasked to deal with that. And that again requires fast ocean-going vessels as opposed to the more stately, patrolling and riverine work for the China Station. So by splitting it in two, not only could you narrow the focus of the two stations, and therefore you wouldn't run through the ship's maintenance wear and tear quite as much going from pillar to post, but it also meant you could tailor the two stations' fleet complements to be a little bit more reflective of what was actually needed, because you also had a gradually developing friendship with Japan. You had the theoretical menace, at least until Tsushima, of the Russians, all of which would be China Station and latterly Australia Station to deal with. But by removing that threat from the East Indies Station responsibilities, then, as I said, you could focus on the gunboats and cruisers that you needed to fulfill that particular area. And so the East Indies Station, at least certainly if you want to look into the history of slave trade suppression, was a very exciting place to be in the latter part of the 19th century. ACC asks, assuming an ahistorical willingness to engage with or be baited into a grand battle by the US, what was the last date in which the Japanese could have won their Kantai Kessen major battle? With a few minor tweaks here and there to the timeline or Japanese doctrine, probably around about the time of Midway. So you'd be assuming an ahistorical Midway, basically a Midway that was predicated around the destruction of the American fleet rather than, strictly speaking, necessarily hitting Midway really hard really quickly. The reason I say that is because at that point the Japanese have Yamato in service, whilst the Americans do have the first of their fast battleships, the North Carolinas, and for that matter, the South Dakota's just about in service. They're not in theatre. North Carolina's on her way, but not there yet, which means that the US forces available in capital ship terms would be just the standards that are left over in the Pacific after Pearl Harbor, and some patching up to some of the less damaged ones. Another slight ahistorical tweak I think you'd need to merge the where you have the problem. Obviously, neither Chicago or Zuikaku's there because one's damaged and the other's had his air group torn up. Get the intact air group on the undamaged one and send that out. That gives the Girabutai another carrier with experienced pilots, and perhaps even for the damaged air group, again, slightly ahistorical, but redistribute that through the other ships to bring their flight groups up to full strength. At which point, you'd also want to take all of your capital ships with you. So the Fusos, the Iseis, the Kongos, Nagatos, and obviously Yamato. And then if we're assuming that the Americans are going to be somewhat more easily baited, that means obviously they're going to throw the Yorktowns in as they did historically, maybe quick draft Wasp in, plus battleships. Quite how they're going to get the fuel and the fast fuel oilers for all this deployment is another matter, but they could, if they were really easy to be baited, perhaps drag in a slow tanker train at that point. It'll be hideously vulnerable, but hey, we're handing the US Navy the idiot ball at this point, so why not? At which point you'd maybe lead with some of your older cruisers and maybe the Fusos conducting a shore bombardment of Midway instead of hitting it with an airstrike. You might send a portion of your fighters to escort said shore bombardment, because obviously the Midway-based aircraft will try and attack the bombardment force. And then, pretty much as I outlined in a previous Drydock, if you can then bait the Americans into revealing themselves and get them very fixated, you can hit their carriers with your own and now much stronger airstrikes, and send in your surface ships, at which point it's probably going to be the Kongos, the Nagatos, and Yamato. Keep the Iseis back with the carriers for escort, mainly because they're just not going to be quick enough, and the Fusos are on distraction duty. But send those with your most modern destroyers and cruisers chasing after the American fleet. Hopefully keep them, again, distracted with it being a carrier fight. And bearing in mind this is early 42, so gunnery control radar and such isn't really much of a thing in the broader US fleet. You then essentially pull off what the Japanese tried to do at the tail end of the battle in Guadalcanal where Hornet was sunk, which is you catch the American surface fleet with your surface fleet. You're outnumbered, but you have Yamato and lots of long lances. You've negated the American air power and their carriers. In theory, on paper, with 5 carriers and that battle fleet, you should be able to win an ahistorical major Midway battle. Of course, that is limiting it very, very much to the battle itself. It's not going to win you the war, because, yeah, okay, fine, Midway will fall. But as we've already said, Japanese logistics, range of operational warships, etc., they can't actually get to the United States to stop the US just building a replacement fleet and coming back at them later. But once you get past that period, past the Midway period, you've lost too many ships, particularly. I mean, you've lost pilots as well, but more specifically the platforms, and the US is gaining platforms, which is then going to make things much, much more difficult. I mean, obviously the American carrier force was pretty much ground down by the end of 42, but if you're going for full Kantai Kessen, that means fleet battle as well, and that means, well, North Carolina gets torpedoed at one point, but you've still got Washington and South Dakota when she's not under major repairs. You're starting to see the first of the new US ships coming in, and outside of getting Musashi in, the Japanese don't really have a huge amount that they can counter that increase in modern units towards the end of 42 with. Alex Hruby asks, based on what you said about sea fortifications and the escapades of the US shore batteries at Wake Island early on in the war, that seems like perhaps one that paid for itself. What other sea fortifications throughout history have paid for themselves? It's a bit of an interesting one, isn't it? Now, as most of you are probably aware by now, I don't really put a huge amount of stock in most sea fortifications I don't tend to think coastal defences really are all they're hyped up to be, or as effective as people seem to think they are. And believe me, there are some slight nutters out there who are really, really bizarrely dedicated to them. Now, as I say, I accept that other people can have different opinions about the effectiveness of coastal fortifications. It is an open for discussion topic. But then again, you'll get people who'll tell you straight to your face that the sea defences of New York Harbour circa 1900-ish, or just after, could withstand the entire combined firepower and assault by the entire period Royal Navy. Because magic, woo, disappearing mount, woobly woobly. I do wonder if those people have had their meds when they post those kind of things. Nonetheless, I mean, as you might have guessed from the picture of Blucher sinking here, Oscarburg Fortress more than paid for itself. A little bit late in life, but it definitely did. I mean, it didn't stop the German invasion, but it did slow it down long enough for the Norwegians to complete some rather important objectives, like evacuating the royal family and the treasury. The Dardanelles fortifications certainly paid for themselves. They stopped the Anglo-French advance on Constantinople-Istanbul. The defences of Gibraltar at the Great Siege of Gibraltar also more than paid for themselves, in as much as, well, they stopped the Spanish taking back Gibraltar, which was pretty much their number one war aim when they got involved in the larger conflict that spiralled out the American War of Independence. And, well, that's been a bit of a bone of contention between England and Spain, or the UK and Spain, depending on the time period, ever since. But outside of those somewhat notable engagements, and there are a few others here and there, the other one, which is a little bit harder to quantify, is coastal fortifications that have paid for themselves because something hasn't happened there. So, for example, how would you evaluate the ridiculous amounts of money poured into the coastal defences of Malta at various stages of time? They didn't ever have to repel an Italian battle fleet or something like that, but their existence did deter an assault. So, how much was saved by their deterrence value? And the thing is, at that point, you really have to try and get into the mind of not the people who are building the coastal defences, but the people who might otherwise have been attacking the country that built those coastal defences, and try and work out, well, would they have attacked, or if they did attack, regardless of those defences, or did they want to attack but decide not to because of the existence of those defences? And, if it was a deciding factor, then you could argue at that point they have perhaps paid for themselves. Whereas if there was just a general willingness to attack that country, but they didn't go after them because they just didn't go after that country as a whole, even though they disliked them, then that's not really the defences themselves having a bit of a deterrent effect. I would argue, for example, if you're following that line of deterrent value, that actually probably Sweden's coastal defences, as part of an integrated defence net, did probably actually pay for themselves, despite the fact they didn't actually have to engage anybody in World War I or World War II to any substantial degree. As I've mentioned before, the Kriegsmarine took one look at the integrated Swedish coastal defence network, which obviously included submarines, torpedo boats, the pocket coast defence ships, and the coast defence guns, and just went, nah, it's not worth it. So at that point, yeah, they paid for themselves, but at the same time, for every integrated Swedish coastal defence network, you can look at massive amounts of money that were spent on huge coastal defence networks in various places, like, I would argue, probably 95% of all coastal fortifications that have ever been built on the British coast, and point to the fact that that was a very expensive way of not accomplishing a whole lot of anything. Texas and LaShock asks, in a companion book to the Honor Harrington series giving an overview of the evolution of ships in that universe, a term that kept cropping up was transitional design. I started wondering, what really defines a transitional design? Given that technology is always advancing, could every design be considered to be transitional to one degree or another? I suppose you could argue that almost everything is transitional to a certain degree, but I think from a more general perspective, you can probably look at a series of designs which all hold to roughly a similar overall theory, I suppose, and then look at a shift, and then everything shifts over to that new theory. So, pre-dreadnought to dreadnought, or possibly dreadnought to super dreadnought, rangefinders and central fire control, for instance. There were better and larger and more advanced versions on incrementally produced ships, but there will be ships that don't have either, ships that have one, rangefinders usually, and then ships that have both. But once you have both, it's just a matter of slight variances, or perhaps major variances, in size and capability, until you introduce something like radar, for instance. So I think there is definitely a definition for transitional design, and I think what you need to do is that I think most ships that could be truly called transitional are probably going to be retroactively designated as transitional. There will, of course, be cases where various elements of new technology are known, and a navy perhaps decides to try out one or two of them, but not all of them in a ship, knowing that it will be a transitional design, but willing to risk it for a proof of concept to see, okay, if this system works, then we can incorporate it and others, or incorporate it more fully into newer vessels. So once you get into the early Cold War, I suppose there's probably, and I say I don't really know as much about it, but I suspect there are probably some ships that were still equipped with significant amounts of gun-based firepower, but also had some missile launchers slapped on to kind of test and see how well that would work prior to the advent of the primarily missile-armed vessel. But back in the period that the channel covers, something like Gloire could be seen as a willfully transitional vessel, something they thought of at the time, because Gloire had big, heavy guns, she had iron armor, and she had steam engines. The steam engines were a somewhat established technology at the time, but combining it with an ocean-going iron-armored hull was new. But she still had a wooden underlying hull structure, and Warrior immediately thereafter pointed really the way, and I think it was Couronne fairly quickly the French built as well, which also had an iron hull. So the French knew at the time they laid down Gloire that realistically an iron armoured warship with an iron hull was going to be the new paradigm, but they went with Gloire partly because they wanted to try and get things in quickly, and partly because the wooden hull was slightly cheaper. But that would be an example of a transitional hull, something that has elements of the old with a wooden hull, but also elements of the new with the armour and the big guns and so forth. But if you look at something like the Ikoma and Tsukuba, which obviously have been on screen so far at the moment, there's this whole thing of, are they armoured cruisers or battle cruisers? Bit of a debate going on there, but they are essentially the battle cruiser version of the pre-dreadnought, I think it's fair to say. But what they envisage compared to the other ships that are around them at the time, I think retroactively definitely makes them transitional, because they are going for an all big gun armament. They're just 12-inch guns. The secondary battery is very much a secondary anti-torpedo boat battery, although it is still split between 4.7 and 6-inch. It doesn't have any of the 7.5, 8.3, 9.2-inch nonsense that was going on towards the end of the pre-dreadnought period. And they are aiming for speed. They are aiming to hunt down armoured cruisers, so they are a step away from the traditional armoured cruiser paradigm, which is mostly intermediate caliber guns, 9.2, 8.3, 10, etc. inches. So they've gone for the capital ship grade armament, but compared to the later main run of battle cruisers, where you would have 8, 10, 12-inch guns, or later on even bigger guns, they are obviously a little bit of a step behind. They're also faster than pre-dreadnought battleships, not as fast as some contemporary armoured cruisers, and definitely slower than later battle cruisers. But at the time, they were probably some of the best that the design elements that the Japanese could come up with, but retroactively you can see them as a stepping stone between the armoured cruiser and the battle cruiser. And to a certain extent, you could almost even argue the same with Hood, because at the time, Hood represented the cutting edge of technology. But if you then look at it retrospectively, you can perhaps see Hood as a transitional vessel between the super dreadnought battleship, whose armament and armour, approximately speaking, she carries, and the fast battleship, which Hood is actually slightly faster than in most, or obviously not all cases. But then you take into account that Hood's balance of speed, protection, and firepower when the main run of fast battleships came along, and to be honest, even when the G3s and their associated designs came along, could be matched or exceeded on less displacement, then Hood is very definitely, I think, a transitional vessel rather than a beginning or an end point. Ash the Lego guy asks, how exactly were ships' timbers and masts seasoned in the Age of Sail? Actually, two completely different ways for those two things. Timbers largely were stored in timber sheds, as you can see here. This could be in a variety of stages, in relatively rough form, for timbers that could be used for all sorts of different things, or if a timber was known that, you know, this particular thing is good for this specific purpose, then they might roughly shape it to that particular shape. Not exactly, though, and leave it to season. But obviously, the more specific a shape you turned a timber to, the more and more restricted your usage got. So they would try and leave the timbers while they were curing as roughly hewn as possible, unless it was just general planking. So the idea obviously is to season it, let it dry, etc., in a relatively controlled environment. Masts, on the other hand, are an entirely different matter. Masts lived in the mast pond, which involved submerging them and getting them thoroughly soaked, which is the exact opposite of what you would have for the main ship's timbers. But it was the same purpose, stabilization and preservation, just obviously slightly different wood, slightly different purpose as well, because you really do not want a dry, brittle mast. You want that flexibility, and that's where these things would be stored. So that's why when shipyards were raided or captured, firing the timber stocks was sometimes as much, if not more, of a damaging move than any loss or gain of shipping, because those timber stocks represented your ability to maintain your existing ships and potentially to build quite a number of newer ships. And if all that went up in flames, that's work that takes years to accomplish. You cannot fast track seasoned timbers. You can build ships out of green wood, but they ain't going to last very long. And finally for this week, Gottjäger asks, was the Admiralty M-N Scheme feasible? Had such a system of fortifications been constructed and maintained in a serviceable condition and perhaps received modernisation or repaired to such a condition at the start of rearmament, how do you suppose their existence would have affected the Second World War? For those of you who are unaware, the M-N Scheme, which you can see partially under construction here, was an idea to build around a dozen gigantic 180-foot tall towers made of concrete and tow them in a conga line across from Dover to Calais, and then sink them into the English Channel. The English Channel in the Dover-Calais area being around about 140 to 150 foot deep at most. They would have remained, the last 30, 40 feet, even in the deepest parts of the channel, that particular stretch of the channel, they would have remained above water. It gets down to about 400 foot in other places in the channel, but there it would have worked. And the reason why they were trying to put a series of 10,000 ton concrete towers between Dover and Calais was in order to string a bunch of anti-submarine nets between them, because they were very worried obviously about U-boats getting out into the Atlantic and passing through the Straits of Dover and off into the Atlantic that way. The quick way was of significant worry, especially in 1917. So the idea was, well, if we can't string a solid barrier across the English Channel the way it is at the moment. They tried minefields and patrols and everything, but it hadn't been as successful as they'd wanted, and you couldn't make a anti-submarine net long enough to go between Dover and Calais. You'd need almost 30 nautical miles of net. But if you put around a dozen towers down, then you only needed 2 miles of net between each tower. And 2 miles of net, that was doable. Now, they were planned to be only relatively minimally armed, a couple of 4-inch guns or something like that. But the war ended before the whole thing could be put into effect. Just these two were anywhere near complete, and only one of them really was complete, so it was taken out to serve as a sort of lighthouse-sea marker, where it still serves to this day, and in fact, being a 10,000-ton lump of concrete and steel, when a cargo ship slammed into it, the cargo ship suffered severe damage and barely got more than a paint scratch on the tower. The other tower was dismantled as of no further use. Now, they would have made interesting spotting and anti-aircraft platforms had they been around, for the Second World War. Their existence could have been a bit of a problem, though, because with each of them spaced, a couple of miles apart, 1.5 to 2 miles, there would have been... The Germans, I think, would have definitely made significant efforts to either destroy or capture the ones nearest to the French coast. And to be fair, there's not a huge amount you probably could have done to hold out on them because, well, they would have been, easily within range of lots and lots of shore batteries plus the Luftwaffe, and with not a huge amount of self-defense capability. But of course, because they're spaced out evenly, at some point along the line, you're going to get to a point where it's easier to defend them from the UK than it is to attack them from France. So you could have ended up with this line of regularly contested towers, probably refitted with hydrophones and ASDIC and depth charge launchers and all sorts of things like that. And some of them would be in German hands and some of them would be in British hands, and there'd probably be raids and counterattacks back and forth for the ones in the contested zone somewhere in the middle of the channel, which would have been interesting, I suppose. I don't think they would have served as much of a conduit for invasion or anything because they're not connected to each other. I think possibly, outside of a slightly interesting back and forth during a large portion of the Second World War, possibly the single biggest implication of them would have been actually post-World War II, because assuming that they had mostly survived, which they probably would have been, because again, they're big lump of steel and concrete, you can't sink them, and to destroy them would require an awful lot of firepower. I have a feeling that post-war that they might actually serve as something of a basis for the idea of a land bridge between England and France. Because 1.5 to 2 miles these days, you could probably just about span that by putting suspension bridge towers on each of these towers. Back at the end of the Cold War, end of the World War II, beginning of the Cold War, maybe not quite, but you'd probably, looking at some of the longer suspension bridges around in the 50s and 60s, maybe only need to double up on the towers about a mile apart each. At which point, given that it took us until the 90s to get the Channel Tunnel, maybe at some point in the 50s or 60s, someone would have said, well, you know what, we're already halfway there. Why don't we've got the plans, why don't we just build a dozen more of these units, slot them in between the existing ones, and we can have a land bridge connecting Britain to France for the first time in forever and a day. Well, since the channel flooded, which would have been an interesting exercise. I mean, they'd have to be very tall to let shipping under, and the weather, you'd have to have your own weather forecast for the bridge, because you'd still be talking about like a couple of dozen miles. So even if you made it multi-lane sort of highway speed, you're still talking about half an hour to drive roughly speaking, to drive between England and France, at which point you would actually need a proper long distance weather forecast, because if you started driving and you got hit by a squall halfway along the bridge, that could lead to some rather interesting road traffic accidents or departures from the bridge into the channel, which would not be good. But that's actually a really interesting little alternate history route to go down. And that brings us to the end of the Drydock for this week, everybody. Thank you very much for listening, if indeed you still are at this point. Next week, of course, 299, we shall be into the Patreon Drydock. So look forward to that next week, and see you again in another video closer to the time, hopefully. Bye for now.